Welcome back, everybody. This is House Calls, From Confusion to Clarity. We're picking up our conversation where we left off. We're exploring fear again today. Hi, Barry. Welcome back.
Thanks, Paula.
Fear is a huge topic, and we're having several conversations about it. From our last conversation, we were talking about fear. Can you give any examples that are relatable to the pandemic so that people can understand when we're talking at a level of fear?
Well, let me give you an analogy, Paula. Suppose that there was something happening on the earth that was going to wipe us all out, or at least we thought it was going to. So the authorities decide that the only solution is that we have to all get on board of these new rockets that have never been successfully launched before, and we all have to get on board and we all have to go to Mars. No ifs, ands, or buts. Well, some of us who can't get on the first rockets might be asking ourselves, is it really wise to get on a rocket that's never had a successful launch before? Maybe we should reevaluate whether or not the crisis facing us is really as bad as they say it is. Or maybe there are other solutions than they say, other than just going to Mars. Or perhaps we should use other rockets that have been tried and true in the past and go maybe to the moon instead. And the same thing is happening here. From the get-go, we were told the only solution was vaccines that have been using brand new technology that has never been successfully used before. Everybody must get this vaccine. And we're not going to look into whether or not this crisis is really as bad as we say, whether all 7 billion of us are really at risk. We're not going to look at whether there's other solutions that we can use. There are 10,000 drugs on the planet. Is it possible one of those drugs or several of them might be useful to reduce morbidity and mortality rather than having to depend on a vaccine somewhere off in the distance? I think a lot of us probably might not step on those rocket ships in the situation I mentioned, and yet we jump into these vaccines almost without thinking.
You know, I like the rocket ship analogy because I can imagine what you're talking about because you've made it very relatable to our situation. The rocket ship is essentially the vaccine. Mm-hmm. And so if you go back to what we said on our last conversation where I introduced the concept of what the government is using, the precautionary principle, they're still using that principle for these vaccines. And it's all still based on fear. It's done without science, actually.
Yeah, I mean, in the past, when we were cave people, we had to depend on fear to keep us safe. And so we had to make very, very quick decisions when we were threatened with something that could compromise our lives. So we depended on a fight or flight response we talked earlier. Stay and fight, or flee somewhere to be safe. Mm-hmm. It was very binary. Those were the only two possible choices we had. So deep inside of our brains, we're wired for kind of binary thinking, one or the other. But the truth is, there are often a spectrum of possibilities in between.
I like that you use the word binary thinking, and I'm going to ask you to explain it a little bit more in case our viewers didn't pick up on that. Mm-hmm. So binary thinking, from what I've just understood, is like it's left or right, and essentially it's right or wrong. Right? So binary is one or the other. Mm-hmm. There is nothing in between. And you talked about a spectrum of which should be of possibilities in between. Could you just explain just a little bit more about binary thinking?
Well, yeah, I think we often don't recognize in modern days how much binary thinking we actually do. Okay. But the pandemic's a good example. Mm-hmm. The modern day flight is that we run and hide and we hope the authorities will have all the answers. They'll take care of us. I won't have to do anything. We won't have to do any thinking. Whatever they tell us to will keep us safe.
Yes.
Or we fight sometimes and we end up being angry at one another. We disagree and we can't seem to have rational, respectful conversations, etc. But if we can recognize our basic fight or flight response, which is so ingrained deep in our brains, we can realize that there's a spectrum of possibilities. And with our left and right hemispheres, the upper brain that marks us as so unique among all creatures on the planet, we can then use our intelligence, our creativity, our problem-solving abilities, etc., to find better solutions than the simple lower brain fight or flight responses.
Would it be fair to assume like that, that binary thinking is coming from this part of the brain?
It's a low part
Yes.
of our brain.
Yes.
Very, very useful, and it's present in all creatures on the planet to
Yes.
some degree. But the truth is that fear can hold us back. You know, and we
Yes.
can have fear about being rejected. We can have fear about the virus. We can have fear about our lives. We can have fear about being embarrassed or about being lonely or fear of failure. There's so many fears that we can have that can guide us to some degree, but they're not usually the best solutions overall.
And you know, it's coming to that awareness, because it's true. If we stay stuck in that binary thinking, like for my example that I shared with the last talk that we had, where I felt that level of fear vibrating through my body, and it's something I won't forget. If I didn't have that awareness that I better change what I'm thinking, I would stay stuck in that, and hands down, that's not healthy. And so, we need to, what we're hoping to do is bring an awareness to people that they'll realize perhaps maybe they have been stuck in binary thinking, which can be dangerous on any scale if you're just stuck in sort of that level of thinking as a habit. And then we need to move beyond it. It's essentially what you said, through the spectrum of possibilities, right?
Yeah, I almost refer to binary thinking as more binary reaction, because actually we're not really thinking, we're just reacting at a very visceral, almost immediate level.
Yes.
But it's understandable, because that's a huge part of who we are, and when we are afraid, we tend to resort to that. But unfortunately, fight or flight tends to, when it's fear-based, involve a lot of denial and avoidance. And although denial and avoidance can be useful to some degree, they're not really good long-term solutions to most problems. So we've seen what flight does in terms of denial and avoidance, but we also seen what fight has done too. We're into name-calling, we're into shaming, we're into threatening people or demonizing people. We can do better than that. And, a lot of us are afraid of our loss of control of our lives. And that's also sometimes what makes us fight or get angry, because fight usually is our anger being manifest.
So how do we move beyond that? How do we move essentially from debate? Well, yeah, we're having debate, and sometimes it's not even debate. We're being silenced, so there is no debate. How do we move from that to where we're having dialogue, what we used to, right? That's exchange of ideas and respect and values for each other.
Well, I think, it's quite sad, but we're becoming so polarized now. It's become a debate culture, and that's really binary, and we can do better than just debating. It's quite true. I mean, if I have my hand suddenly put on a hot stove, it makes perfect sense to remove it immediately.
Yes.
But the truth is, for modern day humans, we don't face those solutions or those problems very often. We usually have time and space in which to develop a more nuanced approach to the problem than just removing our hand from a hot stove. So right now, the first thing I think that's important is to recognize that when we hear binary thinking, the first thing I do is I look for the fear that underlies that binary thinking. For example, people will think, well, if I wear a mask, I'm safe. If I don't, I'm unsafe. If I get a vaccine, I'm safe. If I'm not vaxxed, I'm unsafe. Well, that's very binary. It's really more a matter of degree of safety or degree of protection that a vaccine can provide. It isn't an all or none phenomenon particularly.
I have an analogy in my own life, if you don't mind. I'd like to share it, because I just realized analogies are also a good way to help people recognize it. So this is an experience that my daughter, who was 2 at the time, and I shared. So, as a 2-year-old, and you have grandchildren, they're toddlers, they're running so fast, like you can't even keep up to them. And they don't run in a straight line, and they don't stop on command like sometimes our pets will do. And one time, my daughter and I were walking down a very busy street in Ottawa, and she was beside the stroller, and she was the busy road was on one side, and there was a soccer game going on the other side, opposite. And as she was walking, we were having to go downhill. She was now picking up speed. She was running really fast, watching the soccer game, but she was actually now headed towards traffic. And so I was trying to get her to stop. I couldn't get her to slow down. She was going to head right into traffic. All I could do, Barry, was just shove the stroller ahead of her to knock her off her feet. Now, passerbyers might think that it was child abuse what I was doing, but I was binary reacting. I had no choice but to knock her off, because she was headed into traffic, and God forbid that happen. But let's suppose that scenario kept happening over and over again, and I kept shoving that stroller ahead of her to knock her off. well, shouldn't I be actually looking to say, well, wait a second, maybe I should reassess. Maybe I shouldn't be walking on a busy intersection or letting her walk alone. Maybe I should have her tethered, or, a whole bunch of other things. Because if I'm doing that same thing over and over again, it's becoming abuse of my authority as a parent. But it's so dangerous to stuck in that binary reaction.
And it's so important that we have to first allay people's anxiety before we can climb to that higher level of rational thought. And, the corollary too is that we tend to think that all problems have solutions, but in reality, actually, we're more often dealing with trade-offs than absolute solutions. And that means that we have to explore the full spectrum of possibilities, because we very rarely find a perfect solution. There's always some downside to something that we do. We'd like to have our child be free and run around, but then we realize, well, that's kind of risky, so maybe I've got to somehow tether her a little bit, restrict her freedom, but that balances off then her safety. So we have to look for somewhere along the spectrum in order to find a better solution. And most of life involves finding some trade-off somewhere in the spectrum, not at the opposite binary ends of the spectrum.
Okay. I like it. I like that you wrapped it up like that. Let's pick this up in the next conversation, where we're going to be exploring the many different types of fears.
Yeah, I was thinking, just as we close, that it's so interesting that prior to the pandemic, there was, and even today, there's so much discussion about diversity and how important diversity is. And yet, at a time when we need it the most, we're really not interested in diverse opinions, diverse worldviews, diverse solutions. I haven't really found that the authorities are that interested in any ideas that those of us experiencing the hardships of some of the measures used during the pandemic, interested in perhaps our perspective. And I think that, when you look at it, as we said in the previous video, an awful lot of evil has come about because people only think binary. And a lot of the divisiveness we've had in our society is because we only think binary. And sometimes the government's been contributing to that. It's contributing to that us versus them mentality, which is really about as binary as it can get. And that's very divisive, and I don't think that's going to give us the best solutions we can. But perhaps we'll explore that more in the next video.
Yeah, I agree. Because the wheels are turning, and I'm anxious to pick up on that. Okay, so we'll leave it at that for today. Thanks so much, Barry.
Thanks again, Paula.
Thanks for watching, everybody. See you on the next video.
Thank you.